In my Torat Moshe, we are on page Yud, on the bottom. We're about to discuss Psukim Daled and Hey, of Parak Aleph.
Do you want to read out the Psukim?
I will, as if everybody finds a place.
Yud. Next.
Okay, so the last piece we discussed was the initial pasuk in the creation of light. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do pasuk Daled and pasuk Hey, and this piece is going to discuss how choshech, darkness, is actually darkness as a being, a separate entity from the light, not just its absence. And we'll also discuss the relationship between light and darkness in the day and night cycle. And we might even talk about the primordial darkness of purgatory and the supernal light of Olam Haba. Okay. So the pasuk says like this. It says, Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Vayavdel Elohim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech. So God saw that the light was good, and He separated between the light and the darkness. And the next pasuk says, Vayikra Elohim la'or yom, v'lachoshech kara laila. Vayerev vayehi voker Yom Echad. And God called the or, the light, Yom. He gave it the name Yom, which we translate as day. V'lachoshech kara laila, and He called darkness night. Vayerev vayehi voker, and it was evening and it was morning one day. So there's a few features in this pasuk that are worthwhile to point out before we go further. So the first thing is that in the first verse that we read, it says that God saw that the light was good and He separated between the light and the darkness. So the fact that He separated them, what was the need for that? And what was that all about? Okay, and then we said that God called light, He called it Yom, which is day, and darkness He called night. So what's the significance of these names? And then it introduces two new concepts, and it was evening and it was morning. So what is Erev and Boker? And just one last little detail feature in the pasuk, it says Vayi Erev, and it was evening, Vayi Boker, and it was morning, Yom Echad, one day. It could have said Vayi Erev Vivoker, and it was evening and morning. So why is there an extra Vayihi there? And maybe one last thing, it ends off saying Yom Echad, one day, as opposed to Yom Rishon, the first day. So this is actually an anomaly. In the rest of the days of creation, it says, and it was morning and it was evening, the second day, the third day, the fourth day. This first day, it doesn't say the first day, it says Yom Echad, one day. Okay, let's look at the Torat Moshe. Okay. Limatanu HaTorah. The Torah is teaching us. She'ein ha'or ha'eder ha'choshech. The light is not simply the absence of darkness, or darkness is not simply the absence of light or the loss of light. Rak kol echad koach b'fnei atzmo. Rather, each one is a force, a creation in its own right. So darkness is actually an entity that has a presence. Umagam lema'amaram zal shebiksha hachoshech li'tarev ba'or. We even have the Chazal point out in Bereshit Rabbah that when it says Vayavdel Elokim, that God separated the light from the darkness, that was because the darkness itself, hachoshech biksha li'tarev ba'or, she wanted to actually mix in with the light. She wanted to be involved with the light in a way that God felt needed to be held back. So that's why He separated. So the implications from that statement are that the choshech itself is its own force, has its own ratzon, has its own, it's being propelled to do something, and God reacts or responds to that, meaning that the choshech is its own entity. V'chein, and similarly we see, v'lachoshech kara laila, and to darkness God called light. So it's not just the absence, it's not a name that we give for the absence of light, it's it's a force itself that is assigned a name when God calls it Laila. So, Moreh shehachoshech bria v'havaya b'fnei atzma. That statement in the pasuk that God called darkness night comes to tell us that it is a creation and a being all on its own. V'chein amar Rabbeinu Zal, and further our sages told us, right, when they talk about the light and darkness, they say mashal lemelech shahaya lo shtei legionot. It's like a parable to a king who had two great legions, meaning he had two armies. He didn't just have an army of light, but also an army of darkness. He has two generals. He has light and darkness. Okay. So now, we're going to basically cover in this piece 4 points. This next point is the function of Erev and Boker. We talked about how in the Pasuk it introduced out of nowhere the word for evening and morning, Erev and Boker, and somehow they're part of the cycle of Yom Echad. It's not just a function of Yom and Laila and Or and Choshech. Okay. Od yitachen. Furthermore, it's reasonable, Besum lev el omro, when one focuses on that which the verse says, Vayi erev vayi voker, and it was evening and it was morning. Velo amar, and it did not say Vayi erev vavoker Yom Echad, and it was evening and morning one day. Meaning, why does the pasuk need to have an extra word Vayihi and it was evening and it was morning one day? V'gam, and also achar shekara la'or yom v'lachoshech kara laila. After God already in the verse calls the light day and he calls the darkness night. Hayara oilamar, it would have made more sense, supposedly, to say, Vayi Yom, Vayi Laila Yom Echad. And it was a day and it was night one day. Meaning, what is the day a function of? Is it a function of a cycle between light and dark, which we call Yom V'Laila? Or is it a function of something else that we're calling Erev and Boker? Where do Erev and Boker fit in? Amnam, however, also you'll note over here that the Alshech says, he suggests that when it says that the pasuk should say that the day is a function just of Yom and Laila, it mentions Yom before Laila, day before night, as opposed to night before day, right? So meaning what's our story? Our story was, right, there was darkness, there was Choshech HaPnei Tehom, and then God said, Yihi Or, there should be light. So Choshech preceded the light. And then Vayi Erev Vayi Voker, it was evening, it was morning, Yom Echad. So, one could understand that God just made light, and then that light part was on the back half of the darkness that already existed. The darkness preceding the light, together with the light that comes after, is the cycle of the day, and that's the first day. Right? That would be a valid reading. And yet, the Alshech suggests over here, he says, Vayi Yom, and it was day, Vayi Laila, and it was night, Yom Echad. Because if we're talking about darkness as a creation, that's part of the day cycle, then we don't mean just the darkness, the darkness initially that was just the absence of light. Okay, let's see where this goes. Amnam, however, Hine haya efshar shelo yiyeh shahut bein or hayom l'choshech halayla. Perhaps it would have been possible, picture this, that the day cycle, we use the word yom in two different ways here. We use the word yom as a component of the day, which is the light part of the day, and we use the word yom as a full cycle, which incorporates also darkness into it, right? Vayi Erev Vayi Voker Yom Echad. Yom Echad is what we relate to as a 24-hour cycle that incorporates night and day, okay? So the Alshech HaKadosh proposes here, imagine if the night and the day were total, juxtaposed to each other with no transition. It was totally dark for the period of time that Laila is sholet on the Yom, and then immediately afterwards there's 100% light. Okay? Shelo yiyeh sha'ut, there would be no time or no stall or lag bein or hayom, from between the light of the day, l'choshech halayla, to the darkness of night. Rak shebetom or hashemesh, rather only that with the complete terminus of the light of the sun, yatchil choshech halayla, immediately would begin the darkness of night. Ubetom choshech halayla, and with the terminus, right, of the darkness of light. Ya'ir or Hashemesh, immediately the light of the sun in its full strength would illuminate. Okay, it could have been like that. So then what's the function of these transitions that we experience? Perhaps this was the intent of our rabbis when they said, Ba'amram, shebikshu l'shamesh be'erbuvia. So this is very fascinating. The Alshech Ch1 is proposing that perhaps that the buffer between the light of the day and the darkness of the night is a kiyum of the Havdalah. Meaning when it says Vayavdal, that God separated, instead of them being immediately juxtaposed next to each other in full force, we're going to place buffers in between them. And this perhaps is how he's understanding when the Chazal say that the light wanted to be used or interact with the darkness wanted to interact with the light, be erbuvia, with mixing. It doesn't mean literally that they would mix, but rather that it would be, so to speak, boom, boom, immediately next to each other, they would be touching. So the Alshech Ch1 is proposing that perhaps the Vayavdal means that they shouldn't touch each other, but rather this would demand now something that we call Erev and Boker. Okay? Shehu bli hefsik beintayim. That perhaps when the rabbi said that the darkness wanted to interact with the light bi'erbuvia, with an intermixture, what they intended was shehu bli hefsek beintayim, that it would be without any sort of break between the two. However, hine vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, God saw that the light was good, v'ra'ui lahafsik ben or l'choshech, and it is worthy, it is appropriate to break in between, to separate the light and the darkness, ve'al kain, and therefore, vayavdel Elohim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech, God separated between the light and the darkness. How did he separate it? With what? He sam erev, he placed evening, yom, the erev yom, the settling transition of the day, achar shkiat hachama, after the setting of the sun, kodem l'layla, before the nighttime. Meaning somehow there is a buffer zone that functions there as a separation between the end of the day and the beginning of the night. V'chein b'siluk hachoshech ad zeit hashemesh, and similarly when the night, the darkness of night dissipates till the sun emerges, sam boker or, God put a place called a placeholder that we'll call boker or, the morning of the light, which is before that the shemesh is illuminating at full capacity. V'zeu vayavdil, and this is what the verse meant when it said, and God separated. Nimsa, we find, it turns out, hayom, the day, the 24-hour cycle of a day, right? Kolel includes arba chilukei zmanim, 4 distinct components of time. Ha'or, the light, v'hachoshech, and the darkness, v'ha'erev, and the evening, v'haboker, and the morning. V'zeh ma'amar ha'katuv, and this is what the pasuk meant when it said, vayikra Elohim la'or yom, God called the or, the light, yom, the one of the 4 components, the yom component, hu chelak ha'echad, that's one piece, v'lachoshech, and to the darkness, hu hasheni, is another piece, he called night, vayi erev, and there was an evening, she'achar ha'or, that comes after the light, which is the 3rd component, hu hashlishi, vayi voker, and that's why the verse says an extra vayihi, right, to separate, to note that boker is the 4th component. Boker, the morning, she'achar halayla, that comes after the darkness of night, hu harivi, that is the 4th component in a total day. V'klalut arba'atam hu Yom Echad, and the inclusion of all of these pieces are what make up one day. Okay, that's point number 1. Okay, so this next point is going to address a little bit in depth, perhaps, why we call it Yom Echad, the first day, one day, as opposed to Yom Rishon, the first day. Remember, the anomaly here is that in the first day, as opposed to all the other days of creation, it says day 1 as opposed to the first. The rest of them are in a series. It says by day 2, it doesn't say day 2, it says the 2nd day, the 3rd day, the 4th day. So why here does it say Yom Echad? Okay. The famous answer, just to jog everybody's memory, Rashi brings immediately right over there, that God was Yachid Be'olamo. It was a unique day because God was still alone in the world, because according to the Midrash, that on the second day God created the legions of the heavens, the angels and such, so God was still alone. So it notes that beautifully when it says Yom Echad. But here, following with the theme that we've been talking about as a day being a function of these components, and this is the first time that God is setting up a paradigm of day, now the Alshech Ch1 will tell us perhaps another understanding of Yom Echad, day one. O Yomar, Bisum Lev El Amro Yom Echad, Velo Amar Yom Rishon. Take note, right? If one takes note and focuses that it says day one as opposed to the first day. Vehu kihine ben laomer she'or zeh haya ruchani velo hameorot ubein haomer shehu hameorot ela shelo nitlu begalgal ad yom revi'i hine kitzvat yom valayla ad harevi'i lo haya ayedei sibuv hagalgal. So, we talked about different approaches to understanding the creation of light when it initially talked about it, what that light is. Is it a spiritual light? Does the Or in the Pasuk refer to a light that ultimately manifests as the light of the physical sun? So there are different approaches, and regardless whether we're talking about here the physical light or the spiritual light, it must be noted that the luminaries, the physical luminaries in the heavens that we relate to as being the cause of a day and night cycle, meaning our day and night, we relate to it as a function of the orbit of the sun or the earth, right, around the sun. So that did not really occur till Yom Revi'i. Not till Yom Revi'i did God set up the sun and the moon. So what we have here is a situation where you have a cycle of day and night functioning without the sun and the moon. So whether we understand the Or to be physical or not, at this point where the story of creation is discussing a day and night, it is without benefit of the sun and the moon till Yom Revi'i. Ela shelo nitnu begalgal ad Yom Revi'i. These me'orot, these luminaries were not hung up in the sky, so to speak, put in their orbits till the fourth day. Hine kitzvat yom v'layla, the apportioning, right, the domain of night and day, of day and night, ad haravi'i, until the fourth day, lo haya ayidei sibuv hagalgalim, was not a function of the orbits of the luminaries. Ve'echaita midat yom midat layla. So how did creation experience day and night? Lezeh amar, therefore, the pasuk is addressing it when it says, Vayavdel Elohim ben har uven hachoshech. So here, the Havdalah is not just seen as some sort of need to separate light and day, but actually the night and the day happening is a function of God physically doing it, so to speak. Vayavdel Elohim ben har uven hachoshech, that God is personally causing the day and night to happen in lieu of the luminaries that come later. Okay, ki al yado yitbarach, through his hand, blessed be he, haya na'aseh ha'evdel bein zeh lezeh, was the separation between night and day. Kol echad shi'oro nifrad mechavero, each one having a separate space from its peer. Okay, so vayikra Elohim la'or yom, and God calls the day, the light day, v'lo l'sibuv hagalgal. It's not the light of day because of as a result of the luminaries or its orbits. It's because God is calling it. That's why God was. That's the other meaning of God overtly separating and God overtly calling them. That's meaning God is making the day happen. V'lachoshech kara, and darkness was called night. V'haya al pi hashgachato yitbarach, and it was only through his personal agency and management, blessed be he. She vayihi erev vayihi voker, when it was evening and morning, shiur yom echad, it was one day. Not the first day, but one day. Hanod al pi seder hagalgalim, which meaning it is the day which ultimately will be apportioned through or set up through the function of the luminaries. V'lechein lo amar rishon, and that's why I didn't say first, ki'im, but rather yom echad, one day, ki lo bilvad kiven hayot rishon. It's not just that God had intended that this should be the first of a series, ki'im gam hayot ben ha'erev v'haboker, but rather he's setting up, right, between the evening and the morning, bli sibuv galgal, without the orbit of a sphere, shiur Yom Echad, one day. In other words, or paraphrasing, Yom Echad is coming to indicate here that it is, God is declaring, He's setting up, He's making one day as a paradigm by Him doing it Himself. And therefore we're noting the first time that He did it Himself, He's setting up Yom Echad, what a day is. Okay.
It's not like the first day. This is what day is, the definition of day.
Yes, that's how I'm understanding this. Okay, so now we're going to discuss a third point, which is going back really to darkness as a primordial entity. And once we're talking about that, maybe we'll talk about light as a primordial entity, something that has to do more with just how we experience it in this world. Od Yechaveh. Furthermore, one could understand the intent. Ki hine hachoshech shehaya ad shelo nivra haor eno choshech halayla. The darkness that existed before the darkness that we're talking about now, that was assigned to the night, that which pre-existed the creation of light, that's a different darkness. That's a darkness of a different magnitude. So once again, I just want to remind us that the first pasuk said that God created the heavens and the earth, and then it said that that there was emptiness and nothingness, and there was on the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God was floating over the waters, hovering over the waters. So over there, it says tahom, which is a word for abyss, but we understand that to be referring to darkness, right? I'm sorry, it says darkness. It says v'choshech al pnei tahom, and darkness on the face of the abyss. So it mentions, the second pasuk of Bereshit mentions darkness right before it says vayomer Elokim yihi or vayihi or, that God says there should be light, and there was light, which means the way the narrative is being presented there, that choshech, there's a form of choshech al pnei tahom, on the face of the abyss, that pre-existed the creation of light. Okay. So now, that choshech, when in reference to that choshech, right, that is not the choshech over here that God is assigning to night. Ki harishon, this first, haya ha'eder hakodem lahavaya, that was the nothingness that preceded existence. V'haya choshech muchlat, it was an absolute darkness. Umagam la'omram, it wasn't just a darkness in the absence of light, it was a darkness in the absence of creation. Umagam la'omram she'oto ha'choshech al pnei tahom, and also he's noting that Chazal do say that in the verse where it says, and the darkness was on the face of the abyss, it says, hu choshech gehinom, that's the darkness of hell. V'hu haya choshech shehu va'ala mitzrayim, and furthermore, there's a Chazal that says that in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, during the plague of darkness, that was a portion to them, an allotment from this actual primordial darkness of hell. There's a midrash, and it's Kema'amaram Zal, like the sages say al pasuk. There's a verse in Yecheskel that says He'evalti kiseti alav et tehom. So over there's it's talking about the descent into the lowest places in the netherworld, and it talks about Sheol. And it says that God says, I closed the abyss over it and covered it. And Chazal say that over there, that's kind of, they read that God took from that darkness of Sheol, of Gehenna, and He gave it to them at Makot Choshech, at the plague of darkness. So we see that it's a something, and it's a hellish something. Like it's explained in the words of our sages in Parshat Bo El Paro, in the Sidra of Bo, Bishmot Rabbah, V'zeh Yomar Vayavdil. And they say that this is also referenced when it says that God separated the Or from the Choshech, right? The light from the darkness. What is He doing? Hashem is taking the darkness and appropriating it to the right place for it. Kilomar, that is to say, Behevio HaOr, when God brought forth the light, Lo nitbatel oto achoshech legamre. It didn't overcome the darkness and dispel darkness totally. Rak huvdal lemakom hanaot lo. Rather, the darkness was now separated to a place that is pleasant for it, the place where it belongs. Shehu bagehino, which is in hell. Vihine. Okay, so l'chol perushim. According to all the various explanations, ein oto hachoshech ra'ui likalel be'or hayom likarei shnehem yom echad. It's not appropriate. It wasn't right, according to the Creator, to include within the night, within the light of the day, the darkness. And this choshech that we're not talking about is not referring to a darkness of the second day. Meaning this is not a darkness that comes after. The first cycle of day was, the dark part of it was the darkness that pre-existed the light. It was not a secondary lesser darkness that is later incorporated into the regular function of days. So this is a unique thing about day one. Okay, ve'im kain, and if that's true, meaning why incorporate a primordial darkness into the day? Let the day start with the creation of light, and then follow with a lesser darkness, the darkness that is just a result of a lack of light. Okay, so this goes back to a question we noted that the Alshech Ch1 proposed initially, that perhaps in the cycle, in the creation cycle, in the day cycle in creation, the day should precede, the light should precede the night. Right? We know that when it comes to Yamim Tovim, when it comes to Kiddushat Hazman, the sanctity, right, that the night always precedes the day, right? There are certain halachot that actually the night follows the day. It has to do with karbanot, and the allotted times for certain karbanot to be eaten, etc. So then when it apportions a number of days and nights, the day, it starts with the day and follows the night. But generally speaking, we say time and a function of time and how we sanctify the time. The night always precedes the day. So, but if it's true that the light, in our story, if the light was created first, so the light and the darkness that incorporates in a day would have demanded that it should start with light and then follow with the lack of light, meaning the choshech. Amar ki lo chen asahu yitbarach. God did not do it like that. Rather, vayikar la'or yom v'lachoshech haniska karalayla. The light that God creates, He calls Yom, and the choshech that pre-existed from the creation of light, He calls night. Im heyoto bilti ra'oi likalo b'chlalot hayom, even though it was ultimately not 100% worthy to be incorporated in a regular day cycle. V'lama asake. Why did He do this? Kedei she'al yedei chen, that through this, vayihi erev tchila v'achar kach vayihi foker. And this is sort of to commit to existence, to creation itself, that evening should always precede the morning, meaning the phenomenon of darkness and the lack of light should always precede the rising of and ultimate total illumination of the morning. It should not be that that first it should be morning and then it should be evening one day. And that's why it doesn't say the first day. There's another reason why it made a distinction and said Yom Echad as opposed to the first day. Lomar, that which that choshech was incorporated into a day cycle, Haya Yom Echad, was only one day, bilvad, alone, v'lo yoter. So that's another anomaly of the first day of creation. V'hatam yiyah, and the reason for this is ki ratzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu me'az bara ha'olam lirmoz tachlito. This is because this is an essential revelation that God is intending to communicate about the goal and the ultimate purpose of His creation. Vehu, and that is ki tchila yishamesh ha'erev. First, the erev, the evening, the irbuvia, the mixing of or and choshech and day and night should, meaning the time of erev should be first, should pass. V'hu ha'olam hazeh, and that is not just metaphorically, but also on some level the time of this world. V'tzarot hatzadikim bo. This is a time and a dimension or a world where the travails of the righteous occur. Ve'achar kach, but afterwards, or ha'olam haba, comes the light of the coming world. V'yiyu shomrim laboker, and it's set aside, it's being held for the boker, for the dawning of the light. V'lo yakutsu avdei Hashem asher tzar lahem ba'olam hazeh, and those that serve God will not be in despair from the pain that they experience in this world. Ki or tzadikim yismach, for the light of the righteous will make joyful. Okay, so we're noting here that there's a deep message to all of creation from the fact that God made the night precede the day. And that is that the way the world works, even though reality incorporates both night and day, and it's actually a cycle of olam hazeh and olam haba. And the darkness of the night, the Alshech Ch1 is equating to the pains and tribulations of those that serve God in this world. Despite their serving God, somehow in this dimension they experience pain, or they're able to, and ultimately that is over, and then olam haba shines in full force, and it's always supposed to follow. Okay. So now that we're talking about these things, uvechlal hadavar hazeh, included in this issue, matzanu, we find re'inu tuv tam el das ha'omim mirabotenu zal. We see a really, really good reason for the understanding of our sages. So this is actually an opinion within the sages, she'amro yehi or, that in reference to the verse when it says there should be light, stam haya kodem l'ma'aseh shamayim v'aretz hakatuv l'mal. So there are those that say that even though the first verse of creation says that God created heavens and earth, right? Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And until now, our whole approach has been, we talked about how that means that in the initial moment of creation, everything really was on some level. And then everything following is indeed chronological in the story, so that the creation of light is after Shamayim va'aretz, the creation of the splitting of the waters, and et cetera, all that is chronologically following the creation of heavens and earth. However, for a moment, let's deviate and consider an alternative approach, that there are Chazal that say that even though the verse that says the creation of heavens and earth preceded the creation of the light, really the light came before. And the Pasuk is telling it to us out of order. Why would they say that? So Alshech Ch1 says, well, maybe we can see a really, really good reason why they would propose that. She'amro, when they said Yehi Or Stam, when the verse says Yehi Or, really, Haya Kodem L'Maaseh Shamayim V'Aretz HaKatuv L'Mal, it was even before, preceded the creation of heavens and earth, which is mentioned earlier. Shekasha, this is indeed difficult to understand what they're saying. She'im Kain, if it was true, Lama Nechtav Behepech, then why would the verse write it the opposite? Uma Gam Sheda'atohu, Ki Oto Ha'or Hu Or Ha'olam Haba, She'al Kain Hukdam B'Briya, Ve'al Kain Huvdal L'Tzadikim La'atid Lavo. So according to that understanding, that light that they're talking about that preceded the creation of heavens and earth, that's not the light that's meant to emanate within this creation. That is the light, what we call of Olam Haba, the world to come. And it had to, right, it was created first. Ve'od, ki halo yadanu, ki ha'olam haba nivra biyud, ve'olam hazeh nivra behei, ki biyah havaya tzur olamim. Okay, so there's a verse that says, Ki bi Yah, ki, for with God. Yah is the name of God, right? It's the first half of the Shem Havaya. And it also, right, because with that name, Havaya created, Sur Olamim, he created worlds. Another way to read it is that with the letters Yud and Hey, Havaya fashioned the worlds, Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. But Yud, in the name Yud and Hey, Yud comes before Hey. So if God created, if we're told that God created Olam Haba from the Yud and Olam Hazeh from the Hey, then Yud precedes Hey. So God should create Olam Haba before Olam Hazeh, right? Once again, the verse says, because God created the worlds with Yud and Hey. And we know that Yud, he used to create Olam Haba, and Hey, he used to create Olam Hazeh. So from the word Ka, Yud and Hey, we know that Olam Haba comes before Olam Hazeh, right? Umeharoi, and therefore, it should have told us in the story, right? It should have told us that God created the light before He created the heavens and earth, because the heavens and earth are Olam Hazeh, and according to this understanding of the light, it's Olam Haba, and it should proceed. V'lo yishana seder otiyot Hashem. Don't switch around the letters of God's name. Yud comes before He. Ach ein safek. There is no doubt that indeed, according to that approach, this is exactly what happened. God made the light before heavens and earth. Then why does He tell us about it in His Torah in the opposite order? She'im shenivrat chila nichtav achrechein. Even if it was created earlier, first, it was told to us afterwards. Lermoz al ha'atid, to hint to us about the future. She'achar ha'olam hazeh, only after this world passes, mishamesh ha'olam haba, then comes the role of the future world, kamdubar, like we have been saying. Is that clear? Should I restate it? Meaning, it's true that olam haba is created, is set aside, is fashioned before the creation of olam hazeh. And yet the Torah tells us specifically about it only afterwards to indicate to us that it comes afterwards. And it's important for us to note that because that's the whole point. This is somehow a huge lesson in understanding, contextualizing God's creation.
So can you just explain in details? You're saying that even though it says Vayi Erev Vayi Boker, that God did not create the night first and then the day. He actually created the day first in Olam Haba. Yeah?
Okay, one second.
No.
Two separate things. This last point, we're going to unattach it, unhinge it from the discussion of the day cycle. Now we're going to talk about, in a larger conceptual manner,
Right.
that there's a cosmic day cycle. There's a day of Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. Okay? And Olam Hazeh, which is the Choshech, precedes Olam Haba. Olam Haba always comes afterwards. That's why it's called Olam Haba, that which comes, from our perspective. To know that the good always comes last. That you go through, you wade through all the choshech in life, and then you can be reassured that the day comes. You always, yeah.
Yeah, I understand that, but which did God create first, the day or the
It
light?
depends at what point in the discussion, because we entertained various parallel realities. The first discussion was just straight, was that God created the light, and there was a choshech that is mentioned before the creation of the light. And it could be that subsequent choshech, which was incorporated in day, is of a lesser darkness. That's basically the approach. So that even if day and night, meaning we wanted to note that there is a cosmic darkness that has implications beyond just the darkness that we experience in a day and night cycle. That ultimately we picked up at the end of the conversation and said that this is the darkness of Gehenna. Okay, just like, it's a parallel to the supernal light that was hidden, that sometimes God took it out for some people, sometimes God took out this hellish darkness for the Mitzrayim, so that's a separate night. Now, however, Yom Echad indicates to us that perhaps even in the first day, even though this was not shared in qualities with the other days, the darkness of the Lila of the first day was actually his primordial darkness, and not the darkness subsequently, which is just a lack of light. Okay? Those were some of the points he mentioned.
But what I'm confused still, I wonder if you can clarify that. This idea that God created the light before the darkness. How does that...
No. We never said that God created light before the darkness. In the last point, he said that there are those that say that the light was created before Shamayim va'aretz.
Right.
That when it says Vayi'ar, it really was the first thing. It was the first thing that God created.
Before Shamayim Barak. But really, we always saying that He created the darkness first.
Well, according to the last point, no. What we're saying is that the first thing that God did was create the light, so that the verse, when it says Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'choshech, it's not choshech before the light; it's choshech after the light. According to that last point, it recontextualizes everything, and that's why he says he's only going with that particular approach for that point. I mean, that's something that doesn't work with the approach that he was working until now, and that's why he says, according to that opinion, it would, meaning he shares a point with them, and he raises that approach just to share the point that the day is always follows the night. But he says that approach is that the Or came before Shamayim va'aretz, and therefore the Choshech mentioned in that pasuk is actually after the Or. So he's weighing different ways of possible ways of making sense of reality, but to bring out the same point.
ישכח.
Okay.
ישכח.